Hello, I'm ANEKA from Made to Sew and welcome to my Sewing for Beginners series. In this video I want to show you how to do a satin stitch. Now it might be referred to as a satin stitch on your sewing machine, it may simply be a zigzag, but the satin stitch is a nice way to add embellishment to something. You can use it for applique. You can also use it when you're sewing things such as lingerie or swimwear with elastic, and you can use it to create bar tacks. So let me show you how I do it on my machine. I'm going to begin by changing my presser foot. I'm using foot 20, which is the open toe embroidery foot. The things you need to consider when doing a satin stitch is that firstly you want to have a foot that has space for the width of the stitch. When you're doing a satin stitch, you're using the zigzag stitch, or the stitch has some width, so you need to make sure that you haven't just got a foot with a little hole for a straight stitch. You need to have the space for the width. The other thing is that because it's open here, you can really clearly see what you are doing. And finally, there is a sort of wedge shape on the back. This allows the foot to feed over the fabric and the stitching that you're doing. Begin by choosing the stitch on your sewing machine. You will either need to choose a zigzag stitch, or you may have a specific satin stitch on your sewing machine. I'm going to pick stitch 2 for the zigzag. Then I'm going to need to work with both the width and the length. Now the width is really depending what I'm doing with the stitch. Am I using it to create a buttonhole? Am I using it for applique? Am I using it to sew in lingerie or as a bar tack or something like that? That is really going to depend on the width that you do. For this example, I'm going to bring my width down to 2 millimeters. Then the length is where it gets really important. When it comes to the length, you want your length to be as close to 0 as possible, but still have the fabric feeding through the machine. On my little dial here, I actually have almost a picture of a zigzag, and it's at 0.3 millimeters. It does depend on the thread that you're using, so you're always going to want to test this on the fabric and the thread and the project that you're working on. Now I'm going to work on a little scrap of fabric here, and I'm going to get really close and have a look at how my stitches are working. Are they too close together or are they too far apart? Now, too close together is when I'm sewing, but the fabric isn't moving. So for example, now my machine isn't moving the fabric through. I'm just going to stitch all on top of myself. It will end up in a bit of a mess. So you need to make sure the machine is still feeding the fabric through. Now, I generally try and have a little play and see, right, that's 1 and that is 2. So that is just about feeding through. Can I go to 0.3? Yes, I can, and the stitch still looks good. If I were to increase it too much, you would find that it looked more like a zigzag, and then it doesn't look as good. So I need to decrease it. So you really do need to have a play with your length to get the right length for the thread that you're using. You want this to look like a block of stitching. You don't really want to have any of the zigzag shape. You want it to be a nice block. Now, as I said, the width of the stitch depends on what you are doing. Are you doing a buttonhole? Are you sewing for some applique? It might also depend on the thickness of your fabric as well. So you are going to need to test and see what you're happy with. I have a tutorial that shows you how to use this for applique, and I'll pop a link to that here. Make sure that you are feeding the fabric through the sewing machine. Do not push or pull the fabric when you're doing a satin stitch, because you will change how the stitch length is performing, and you'll find throughout the satin stitch that it won't be consistent. Taking a look at our example there, you can see that this second part is much nicer. I'm now using 0.3 on my length. In that middle section, it looked a little bit too much of a zigzag, and at the start it was almost puckered my fabric up where it was not moving through the sewing machine. So it really is a case of having a test, seeing what works for the fabric and thread that you're using. When you're doing a satin stitch, you may find that it's worthwhile using some stabilizer. I'll pop a link to this tearaway stabilizer in the description box below. You may need to pop this underneath or on top of the fabric that you're using. depending on what it is you are doing. And this will just help to stabilize the area. If you're using this for a buttonhole, then I pretty much always recommend that you interface behind where the buttonhole is going to go. You will find that this will help to feed it through the sewing machine and provide you with a really professional finish. Backstitch at the start and at the end of your satin stitch if you really need to secure an area. Otherwise, for applique and more visible finishes, I pull my threads through and tie them off. I'll pop a link to how to do that here. There you go, that looks so much better. Thanks for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video.